Welcome back to the Practice Makes Faithful podcast. Once again, I'm joined here by our lead pastor at Grace Chapel, Paul.
Good morning.
And by Rob Shaver, our discipleship minister.
Hello, hello.
And we are excited today to be continuing to dive into this series that we've been on called Back on Track. We're in the third part of that series, but it's actually our 7th episode of Practice Makes Faithful altogether. So we're excited to continue this conversation.
Quite a holy number as well, number 7.
Yeah, it is.
So
Expect
probably going to be
things.
a really good episode, yeah.
No pressure, Rob.
If there was ever an episode that you accidentally said practice makes perfect, then this should have been it. But
well done, touche.
There you go. That's a high call out of this episode.
Right. Practice makes faithful. All right.
So this series is all about making disciples, and specifically been looking at the church in Corinth and what the Apostle Paul wrote to them in this letter in the first century. So Rob, with that in mind, would you kind of give us a little bit of an update of what we've been talking about? Fill us in, give us a snapshot of where we've been in this series for anyone who may be tuning in for the first time. Just give us a little bit of a recap on where we're at.
when you think of the letter to the First Corinthians, when you think of the Corinthian church, they are often categorized as kind of just being messy and messed up. And with that in mind, then you read through the text, and for me at least, a lot of times that's what just jumps out as the problem. Here's the problem, here's the answer, here's the solution, here's how it's addressed. But when you kind of step back and look at the bigger picture of the text, to me, what really jumped out was some stuff early on, and then midway through in chapter 10, and the end of 9 and the end of 10, where Paul really is saying to them, look, this is my example to you, is that everything that I'm doing is about bringing glory to God, and the way that I'm doing that is I make myself a servant to everybody so that I might win some. Yeah. And this kind of being the guiding force for them, really this is what it's all about. You've got all these issues, and here's how we can clean those things up specifically. But in a bigger, grander picture, you have these issues because you're focused on glorifying yourself instead of glorifying God. Mm-hmm. And in your making disciples, even that's more of a self-glorifying effort rather than a self-dying effort, which was how Paul was trying to go about it. And so a lot of this in the early text here, which is where we have been for the last couple of weeks, is that reminder, is Paul saying, hey, remember when I was with you, remember the gospel that I preached, remember the way that I was, the way that we interacted, and kind of calling on those things to prompt them before he gets into the arguments of the individual things. So we see it at the end, and then as a prompting of, hey, remember, this is what I taught you, this is what it's all about. Mm-hmm. Glorifying God, making disciples.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I especially like what you've kind of brought out in this series, that likely the issue that they had at Corinth, or a problem they didn't have, is that they weren't growing. I don't think that was their issue. I think you're right. I don't think they had the problem that they weren't making disciples, that they weren't trying to bring more people to be a part of the church, but it was just that their church was kind of a sloppy dysfunction at times, and that the way that they were making disciples was just in a very unhealthy way, like you said, a very us-centered thing instead of a God-centered thing, not necessarily an other-centered thing. And I think that's been so good for us to look at, even as you pointed out, 1 Corinthians 11:1, Paul saying, follow me as I follow the example of Christ, and just this reality that if we aren't making disciples of Jesus, then we're off mission. So if it's not Jesus that's the focus of what we're doing, we're off mission. So with that as a backdrop, give us a basic overview of what you shared this weekend, and then maybe we can try to get a little bit more granular once we have that framework in place.
Yeah, we live in a world, too, so this would go back 2 weeks ago, where that is such a temptation in the church, right? Because there's so much competition out there as far as what people are paying attention to. Mm-hmm. And so instead of saying, hey, we're a church and we promote Jesus Christ, it's very tempting to get shot off into all of these other issues,
right?
And to be attractive to people because, look what we did with this, or what we did. And not that that's evil, but when that becomes the main thing ahead of Christ, then then it's easy for you to stay off track. So that was 2 weeks ago, kind of saying one side of this coin was, like one way that we go off is by trying to be impressive to people. And so what we looked at this week in this lesson was, it's also which people are you trying to impress?
Yeah.
And for them, there's the reminder of, it says, remember that when you were called, not many of you were wise by human standards, not many were impressive or wealthy or of noble birth. And so Paul's kind of framing this to them. Remember who you were when you were called. You were not that special. I feel like there's a good implication then that when they were trying to impress these Jews and Greeks, it wasn't, that's everybody. That's how they categorized the whole world. You were either a Jew or you're a Gentile. And so it wasn't just about trying to impress people, but specific people, probably the same people that he's calling out, the wealthy, those of noble birth, those who were wise. And so the people in your society that were the haves and the people with power and authority, we're all kind of naturally drawn to want to impress them. Nobody walks down the street and you see like a homeless person, you'd say, I really want to impress that homeless person.
Yeah.
And so I think it's very easy. That was definitely going on in Corinth. It's so easy for us to relate. So that's what we talked about.
Yeah. I think yesterday the way that you put it that I thought was, it really kind of hit me was when you talked about, as church leaders, we sometimes have even this framework for who we hope makes up our audience.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
So we try to be impressive, but then we also want impressive people in our audience. And boy, that was really convicting for me, and really just a great kind of a paradigm flip to think about it that way. So I really appreciated the way you framed that.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. And I think it's really evident that as we're looking through Scripture that God has a lot to say about caring for those who are less fortunate, about caring for the poor, the vulnerable, the marginalized people, we might refer to that as. And so as we kind of dive a little bit further into that, into what that looks like, I guess I just wonder, who are those people? Who are the marginalized in our life? And maybe even just define what that word means. And Paul, you might give a stab at that. Like this definition of marginalized people is often language that we're using today around that. And then kind of who are those in our own lives?
Early in the lesson, I made reference to the parable of the Great Banquet. And in that, Jesus is talking about, just this king who's created this great meal for people to come to. The servants go out at first and get all kinds of excuses back, and so the king says, well, hey, invite even more people, and then go even invite the lame and the blind and the poor. And so they go and get those people as well, because that's his main motivation. He wants the room to be filled. I think that can be specific, especially in those times, those certain categories that are called out, the poor and the blind and the lame, that they would have been people in that day that definitely were marginalized, and probably all those categories still fit today.
Yeah,
but it's fair. It's also symbolic of a lot of different things, and I like what you said, Paul, about like who do we want to do church with, especially when it comes to that.
Right.
And I know that was my situation. 6 or 7 years ago, I was sitting in my living room with a group of 8 or 9 people, and we were starting a church. And when I looked out to who my neighbors were, there was a lot of people on my block that couldn't speak English, that didn't yet even have a high school education, or even their maturity level was lower than high school level. And so when you're thinking about, okay, we're starting this church, we're trying to get this thing off the ground, these people that in my mind I made this judgment, like they're going to take my time. They're going to suck the life out of the church. What we first need is people that we can really build with. And so when we started, we did not approach those people. We went out of our neighborhood and just different activities that we were involved in personally, like playing sports outside of the neighborhood, going to the library, which was in the neighborhood, but people from the outskirts would come in for some of the programs, and we would meet people that were past the poverty level and more into the middle class level, and we were trying to connect with those people. And we did events at the zoo and at the art museum, and that was a certain type of people that we were trying to reach. And we got a lot of excuses, and it was reading through as a small group this parable of the Great Banquet that opened my eyes to what I had been doing. And so we just changed and said, okay, we tried for a couple months. For the people that we really wanted to do church with, now let's just try to connect with the people that God's putting in our lives. And that was the poor, and it was the uneducated, and it was the foreigners. And the next couple of years of our lives completely changed, and we heard a lot less excuses and a lot more people interested in the Lord. Now, I'm not saying that that's typical, but just to go back to the question about who are the marginalized, and we can say that categorically and draw lines, but really it comes down to, for me, that was, who was I marginalizing? Like, who was I pushing to the margins, and who was I prejudging to say, not even that if they would be interested in Jesus or not, but do I even want them to be? Which is, I mean, it's sad to even say that. I mean, that was really what was going on in my brain. And I felt completely justified in it, in the situation I was in.
And I love that you share that, Rob, because I think we've all been in similar situations. I mean, I can think of that in leading a small group. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's easier in leading your small group. If you want your friends in there, the people that you're close to. And sometimes it's easier to not reach out to people that are outside of your own social group, outside of these people these are my own close friends. And now we're going to reach out to those who maybe I've marginalized, maybe around the sidelines. And that's been a learning experience for me. Yeah. And I get that.
If they're gonna be, so maybe this is a good definition. If they're gonna be needy, if they're gonna be disruptive, right, like that, then we don't. Or if they're gonna make us feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Like I mean, those three things. I wouldn't. If you said define marginalized, I wouldn't have said that. But when you personalize it, those are the people that we are pushing to the margins. That we don't really want to. I don't want to be around people that make me feel uncomfortable, right? Or that are always needy, or they're disruptive. And like, we've got a good thing here, like in the small group situation. Like if this person comes in, I feel like they're going to mess it up. Yeah. So let's not invite them in.
Yeah, I think too, what you just said is kind of what has been bouncing around in my mind as I think about this conversation about the marginalized. And certainly we can acknowledge this in Jesus' day. You just used the phrase push to the margins. In Jesus' day, those who were on the margins were there because they had been pushed to the margins. They were truly outcast in a sense. So they were intentionally kept at arm's length, not just by individuals, but by society. And it was almost acted as though that was proper. That was the right way to do this. So these people were on the margins because potentially they had done something wrong in their mind. The idea of the man who was born blind, even, who sinned, this man or his parents, somebody had to be at fault here. So we are now justified in keeping this man at arm's length because he was born blind, he's an outcast. Beggars at the city gates, well, they could stay at the city gates, but they were kept there in a sense, here's where you can be, you can't be anywhere else. You can't come inside this circle. People who were unclean, and certainly there was something to that, both spiritually and physically, to the idea of being unclean, and there was a ceremonial uncleanness that I think was right within the practice of Judaism. But then there was a whole type of societal uncleanness that emerged as a second ring of what it meant to be unclean, and now meant that I can distance myself from you because you're not okay here. And so, even lepers were very much kept, not just at arm's length, they had to be kept, they could be within the range that you could hear them, but they couldn't come any closer than that, really. And so you have this whole society set up where people were pushed to the margins. And we might look back and say, well, that's something that happened then. And it is interesting because sometimes you hear the language when we hear about marginalization, you hear about it talked about in two ways. One, you hear some people talk about people who just exist on the margins of society. Mm-hmm. Okay, so there are these people that just exist on the margins of society. And I think there can be truth in that, but we also have to acknowledge the other side of it too, that there are people that are sometimes who find themselves on the margins because they have been pushed to the margins. Mm-hmm. They have been absolutely kept at arm's length. It's not, we often want to put it just like with like the man born blind. We want to be like those folks who say, well, what did he do or his parents do so that he was in this place?
Right.
Mm-hmm. So whose fault is it? Well, it's his fault that he's there, his parents' fault that he's there. But I think sometimes in asking the whose fault is it question, and I'm not removing responsibility in that. I think certainly sometimes people who exist on the margins, they have worked to put themselves on the margins to some degree, or maybe that's where they actually choose to live. I got it, and that can be fair. Mm-hmm. But we need to be, when we're talking about ourselves, we need to ask this question of ourselves. Are there times where I use the question of blame to justify someone's existence or push my own pushing of them to the margins? So I think that's good for us to kind of flesh out this idea of what it really looks like or what it means to be marginalized in society. And I'm sure our listeners are thinking about a bunch of different ways that plays out. But I'd like to, Rob, I know you've got a counseling background, and so you think about human behavior. I do too, and so I enjoy thinking about that. So I think this would be a really good question to try to think through, work through just a little bit. And we were kind of in our show prep, we were talking through this a little bit, and so I think this will be productive to work through this a little bit further. So here's a question, and it's really a two-part question. So first, It's this. So why do you think so many of us are naturally inclined to avoid people who live on the margins of society, or maybe even keep them intentionally at arm's length? And then the second question, which really does go along with it, why do you think Jesus was so drawn to those who lived on the margins? And then why is it so important that we would be as well? So if you want to deal with those one at a time, we can come back and rephrase them again. But the first question, why do you think we're so naturally inclined to avoid people on the margins of society?
And maybe kind of going back through your comment that led up to that, I think sheds a lot of light on it. So, and I think of two of the most well-known parables that we know. And so one is that we do attach judgment. When somebody is on the outskirts, when they're in the margins, right? We often we attach that with there's something wrong with them, right? Yeah. And so that goes. Yeah. So I think of the Prodigal Son, and that's such one of the elders in Utica did a lesson on this a couple of years ago, and it was just one of those simple truths from the text that you hear it and you're like, well, yeah, that's true. Why did I never see that? But he was pointing out that the text never says that when he's in there feeding the pigs that it was his fault, that it was because he had squandered all his wealth. Did he go off? Did he do the wrong thing by taking the inheritance? Sure. Did he do the wrong thing by going off and spending all the money? Yeah. But why was he in that bind? Because there was a famine throughout the land, right? So if the famine had not come, then maybe that guy never gets in a spot so desperate where he comes home. Yet we read that, and we read about this natural disaster type of thing that's going on in the whole land, and yet we look at him and we're like, you did this, you deserve this. Certainly he did things, but we tend to not look at all the circumstantial evidence and just look at the individual and what they did. So that's one thing, is we are just naturally judgmental. Second thing, we are naturally, we're immoral fish, right? We tend to be immature and selfish and worldly. But so the other parable is the Good Samaritan. And what do we know? It's so there's two people that walk by. There's this guy dead, well, not dead, almost dead, beaten, and on the side of the road. And the first two people that walk by him are a priest and a Levite. So a lot of the speculation is at least one of them or maybe both of them, they don't want to take the chance. If this guy is in fact dead, then they would be unclean. And then that's just work, right? Like, if he's not dead, that's work because you're going to have to help him. If he is dead, that's work because now you're going to have to go through all the whatever you have to go through so you're not unclean anymore. And so that kind of self-preservation in us, I think that causes us to want to avoid something. If somebody looks like they're going to need help, do I really, like, how far down is that rabbit hole going to go?
Yeah.
Right. And we tend to think of that.
Yeah.
And get scared by it. So I don't even want to offer a little bit of help because of the potential that might mean many days of my life giving over to this person. Jesus was different. I think Jesus was different because he was mature and he had died to himself already.
Yeah, right.
Those are big things, but really, and he had this eternal worldview, and just saw things in a different way. He understood what his life was about, not that he would be served, but that he would serve and give his life as a ransom for many. And I think even people in the church who claim to be mature Christians, that's a struggle. We still want to be served, or at least to serve ourselves, and not be a servant to all.
It's a really, really good point, Rob, and I love how you brought out that interpretation of the story of the Prodigal Son. And I really think that sheds a lot of light on that first question for me when I'm thinking of why I tend to avoid people who are marginalized in society. And it's so easy that I think in our own culture we're so individualistic minded that it's so easy that when we drive by, you see the person living in homelessness who's asking for money, and we think that, well, that's just a result of their actions. They made a lot of bad decisions. I made better decisions, so not too worried about that. And that person probably made some bad decisions. That person also probably had a lot of bad life circumstances that were out of their control. So it is a little bit more complex than that. But I know just some of the worst moments that are just the most disgusting in my own heart when I look at that is just seeing these moments where I've had that sense of arrogance of just thinking that I'm a little better than that person because I made some better choices than he did. Yeah. And it's so easy to fall into that. I think sometimes we avoid those people because sometimes it's just an attitude of arrogance that I'm better. I made better choices. Mm-hmm. So they made their bed, they need to lie in it now. And that is obviously a very un-Christ-like attitude, but I've seen it in my own heart of that pop up. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a drive at times.
Yeah.
Can I bring up one more and maybe get you to speak into this one some? And I know we've had conversations about this before too, so I don't think it'll catch you off guard. But as I've talked with a lot of people, you hear from folks, I helped that way before and I was burned. And I'm afraid to put myself in that situation again. Yeah. And so they were burned, and there's some hurt that goes along with that. So that's maybe sometimes a little bit more gracious interpretation of why we might not help. I think your first two are spot on. I think there are those of us. I can remember a time we were invested in this ministry that we were part of in West Virginia. We were engaged with a project in the community, and we would go and bring Christmas gifts to these kids. Mm-hmm. And this was quite some time ago, so I'm going to age myself in this and that. Flat screen televisions were a brand new thing. Plasma TVs were a brand new thing. And so, my wife and I, who were, she was working to get through college. We were struggling, very, very low income setting for ourselves at that point in time, but we had enough. And so we were able to, with some of the other folks in the church, go together to buy some Christmas presents to take and deliver. This year we were delivering. Normally we actually had them come to us. But we were going and delivering these Christmas presents to these kids. And I remember the door coming open to one of these, one of these residences in this housing project, and seeing my first ever flat screen TV on somebody's wall and thinking, I mean, I'd heard of them, but it was the first time I'd ever seen one. And I remember thinking, how in the world? But then coming home and being calloused a little bit too, because we had spent money and we didn't have loads of money at that, like I said. So I think I was working, Lori was doing some part-time stuff, but going to school at the same time. So we were, we bounced checks every now and then, let's just put it that way. And so, I remember really struggling after that for a while and having a hard time getting back to the place where I would work through that callous. I know you've worked in, you came here from Utica working in a setting like that, living in a setting like that for a time. So I don't know, maybe you would have some thoughts for those of us who feel like we've been burned before, but we want to. Our heart wants to, we want our hearts to be in the right place.
Right.
That's good.
A little bit, like if you're only listening to us and not watching this on YouTube, Paul actually just opened a little can of worms, and they're
running on the table right now.
Because that
squiggling.
Yeah, that is. I mean, we could just talk for hours and hours about that, right? I mean, in the last 10 years, there's a couple of books that have been written. Like one is called Toxic Charity, and I think one is like Helping Without Hurting.
Mm-hmm. When Helping Hurts.
When Helping Hurts. Thanks.
Yep.
And they're both really, really well done. Those. But looking at that, and I think that's one of the problems, is that sometimes when we try to, we want to help and we want to be the good person, but the way that we go about it is not that great. So I think that's, so here, that could very easily be done, and a lot of churches do it. Like, oh, we want to help people, we want to help the poor, so and you see churches a lot do that kind of thing. It's Christmas, let's give the kids Christmas gifts. Well, how did those people ask for that? Are they saying this is what we really need? Maybe some of them are, but so when we from our perch, where we kind of look down and say, okay, here's what you need, or this, it's not even that. Sometimes it's not even this is what you need. This is what I will give you, so I feel good about myself. I'm not saying that's what you and Lori did those years ago, but I think then that creates a disjointed kind of relationship with people, and where the church becomes the giver, and the poor person becomes the receiver, and then where we are a priesthood of all believers, if that person would ever come to the church through the generosity of the church, it is very, very rare that those people ever really feel like they're on the same level. They don't ever really feel like they are a part of the church, is because the relationship that has been formed is the church gives and I receive. And it takes so much work and effort. It's so rare. There are those stories, and they get highlighted, of the person that makes the transition and they become on the even plane, and then they actually also become a giver. And so I think there's some of that is how we treat people, and that is a way that we can be generous while keeping people in the margins. If that makes sense, so I'm going to do this nice thing, but I'm not, I'm not downing all programs like that. I think there are better ways to do it and go about things, but really it's about having some kind of personal interaction, and reaching out and touching somebody in their life and finding out what's going on and what they need, and building rapport so that can even happen. Right, because there's a lot of distrust either way, I don't know. So that's one side of it, but then on the other side, I think we just need to pray for wisdom, because there's an element of how often should you forgive somebody 7 times 70? It's just like our forgiveness should not end, but that doesn't mean that, like, you can think of those situations. I think of talking about counseling stuff, and I think of that book Boundaries. In one of the cases they give this example of parents, I believe that their son had a drug problem, and they just, every time he was down and out, they rescued him. And so really, they're talking about like they felt like that has got to be one of the hardest things in the world to do. Like if your child is struggling with something, to not rescue them, because it seems so unloving to at some point cut them off and say, we can't do it because we're enabling you. Every time you do this, if we bring you back into the house and set you back up and get you back going, and then you use that kindness and get back to this, that's enabling you. So we really just need to shut this off. And so, it seems like it's not love, but sometimes that's the most loving thing you can do. I can't make that as a blanket statement, right?
Yeah.
That if you've got a kid with a drug problem, because I've heard success stories both ways. Success stories where the family said, no, we're cutting you off. We're having this intervention. If you don't change, and that person, that they stick to it and change happens. And you see it where change happens because the family was kind and compassionate, and they kept bringing them back, even though they kept getting burned. They kept showing love, and then that's the person's testimony. I changed because they never gave up on me. And so I think that is what is so hard about this. Is it'd be great if we could get on a podcast and just say, all right, people, we figured it out. Like, here's the answer. Here's how, when you get in this situation, here's what you do. And it's just, it's complex and it's messy, and you're gonna mess up. Like, and
is it fair to say, while that piece is what Jesus is calling us into in wisdom, to learn through engagement with the Spirit and through relationship how we should minister to somebody and determine whether there are proper boundaries that are determined or not. There's a distinction between that, engaging that way, and being at the place where I think we're always called to be, which is to say, very authentically, there is a place for you here. Is that a fair way of wrapping that together in a sense? We're an open place. We're truly an inclusive place. We're not going to be exclusive. I mean, that seems to be what James is urging. Don't play favoritism. Mm-hmm. Don't do that. This is an open place, and everyone belongs. There are no margins here in that sense.
Right. As a church.
Yes,
that's
as a
who
church.
We would be. Yeah, and just to think about, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. What does it mean to be a member of a church? Because I know, I've had it happen to me just because I was a minister, that you go out to the mall, and I don't know, do they still have malls? They don't have malls.
I haven't been to a mall in a while, no.
You see somebody from the church, and they're with a friend, and they're like, oh, this is Rob. And it's not, and you get disowned, essentially. They own the relationship, that you're somebody that they know, maybe because you went up to them. But all of a sudden you just feel like this person is embarrassed about who I am. And I think there's definitely layers to it. So the first layer is certainly Sunday morning, or whenever you gather together, you want that definitely to be an atmosphere of friendliness and kindness. But I think a lot of churches are friendly but not friends. They're brotherly but they're not brothers.
Yeah.
Right? And so that is where the rubber really hits the road. Is, all right, we can all play nice on Sunday morning when we come together to worship God, great. But what happens next?
Yeah.
Right.
That's right.
And that's the convicting part. Because if we kind of come and then we leave, and then we all just call on our friends and say, hey, let's form a small group because I like you and you like me and we have fun together, then where are all the people that aren't fun? Where do they fit in? And aren't like me. So if you're not like me and you're not fun and you're not whatever, then and that happens.
That's good.
Yeah.
Man, that's really, really some helpful stuff, Rob. I appreciate you sharing on that. I think before we move on, I do want to circle back to kind of the second part of the question that Paul had asked, and just dive into that again. It's just is why, we kind of looked at maybe what it is in us that makes us marginalized people, of why we avoid those people. But why do you think Jesus was so drawn to those people and wants us to be as well?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think, because we're so drawn to the other group, and because Jesus is our perfect example, I think that a lot of it is just about that, is to kind of showing us the way, right? Like he's got to go and show because say like the Samaritan woman at the well, because we do this, like if you start diving deep into anything discipleship right now, and you're eventually going to hit this principle of the person of peace, right?
Yep.
And so that's Luke 10, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so Jesus sends out the 70 or 72, and he says, go find somebody, and when you get to a particular town, just stay in the one place. And this is what we're calling the person of peace. Now, in modern day teachers are going to unwrap this thing as like, okay, this is a person that has got connections in the city and like knows people, and they're going to be influential, so that essentially saying like, if you can convert them, make a disciple of them, they're going to go through.
Right. It'll open the doors.
Now, I think that kind of puts a certain bent on who that person would be. And our standard,
right,
in 2022 in the United States of America, when we think of like that person that's going to have influence and whatever, we get a picture in our mind. Jesus goes and talks to the Samaritan woman, like she was his person of peace, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Get me some water.
Yeah, that's good.
And that was the initiation. I think things like that happened from Jesus, but then also his disciples learned that from him, and we see it in Acts, and God institutes it in other ways. So you see it in Acts, where we did a Bible study not too long ago. I think we looked at Acts 16, right? Because Paul preached about the jailer, right? The Philippian jailer. And so in Philippi, the first converts in Philippi were the Philippian jailer, the servant girl, right, and Lydia. So a woman, mm-hmm, a slave, and a Roman, or a Gentile.
Yeah.
So earlier on in the book of Acts, we see one of the early converts is the Ethiopian eunuch.
Right. Yeah.
All right. So talk about, like, we get hung up on gender issues today. They probably had similar questions back in the first century. And so here's this guy who's, for all intents and purposes, made to be like a woman, right? And yet a big point is made in the book of Acts, not just to tell that story, but to get that person the truth about Jesus, right? And to tell the story of how they come. So one of the first converts we see to Christianity was a man who wasn't really a man, right? And so I think those things are out there and they're told to us, and Jesus lived that way to prove that point. His kingdom was an upside down kingdom, right? Like the first will be last and the last will be first. And so you look at this world, and and his brother James then, not just in chapter 2, says about like, okay, look, a rich man and a poor man, somebody well-dressed or not well-dressed, come in among you. How do you treat them? But he also talks earlier about specifically about the poor, and like that God, that they're honored, right? And that
right,
that they have an opportunity to even be more spiritual than the rich person. Jesus taught. So, because I think it's just the way of society. It's how we'll always be. We're going to honor the rich and the powerful, the wise. We're going to lift those people up. We're going to run after those people. We're going to try to impress those people. We want those people to be in our groups and in our churches. And so Jesus went out, and he's like, I'm going to call 12 disciples to follow me, and they're going to be all people who were rejects from other rabbis.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to go out, and the people that are the haves, I'm going to kind of bust their chops a little bit. And he even says that specifically. and this is another verse like that flows with the whole thing. Maybe I'm talking too much here, but
No, you're good.
it's not the healthy who need a doctor. And so if Jesus is the great physician, this was his role that he's called on by God.
Yeah.
And these are the people that made excuses. They all had other things to do. And those are the people in our lives that we might keep trying and keep trying. I keep inviting them to church. And I'm not saying to give up on them, but just to say they've made their excuse, and there's somebody else that God has put in your life that you don't even see, that he's like, will you please now go into the streets and the alleys? Will you shake the bushes? Will you invite the people that you're not inviting? And it's just, and I told you guys about my church planting story. That was not just, we read Luke 14 and I was cured. Like, I still have that disease, right? Like, because I remember a year into it, and like I was keeping a journal, and like a year into it, I look back at like my notes and like my journal writing, and just be like, oh my goodness, like I was so convicted then, and we changed some things, but it's just so easy for me to go out in public and to just start judging people, and to go back into that mode of who do I want to do church with, who do I want to, and I still struggle with it today. It's just, I don't know. That's my long answer.
It's really good. So I think this has been a really good conversation today.
Yeah,
And we
challenging one for sure.
For sure. And we've talked about who these marginalized people are in our own lives, in our own world. We've kind of talked about why we tend to avoid those folks, and then we've talked about Jesus' heart for them. So I guess now, as we come towards the close, our podcast is called Practice Makes Faithful. Thankfully, it's not Practice Makes Perfect because none of us are perfect at this.
It'd be overselling things a little.
Right.
Yeah.
But what does it look like for us to be faithful, for us to practice this, to practice caring for these people?
Good question. I think I'm a huge fan of baby steps. I mean, if you're ready to take a big leap, then take it. But look in the church, and I know that this is what we do. We do that. We judge people, and we think, like, they're not like me, and so, like, not everybody does this, but some people think they probably don't want to talk to me. And so it's not all like selfish and like, oh, I don't want to deal with that person. Sometimes it's some self-abasement or like insecurity. Yeah. And you're like, they probably don't want to talk to me. So I would say, if we want to practice, we can practice every Sunday and find somebody who's just not like you and strike up a conversation with them. And if you go into most churches in the United States, most churches find people who are single, just single on their own, or single because they've been divorced, and I guarantee you they feel like second-class citizens. Now, I don't know, maybe you can disagree with me, but I think for the most part, there's a feeling of being a second-class citizen because the church exalts the family, right? If you're married
that's true.
And you've got a family, well, look, we've got all these special things for married people and families. Now, some churches have singles programs or things like that, and that's good. But a lot of places I've been in,
With the goal to get you not single, right?
right,
Yeah.
right. We feel so bad for you.
Yeah.
It's divorce. There's a huge stigma put on
Right.
divorce. There's a huge stigma put on mental illness, and it's the way that we talk. It's the way that we talk about things, and I think that we need to are you guys familiar with the term microaggression?
Yeah.
So if you don't know what that is, look it up. But it's it's little things that we can say. And in the church world, we can say things like, "Oh, I'm glad I didn't grow up like that." And these people, oh yeah, they had sex before they got married. Blah, blah. Well, there's a good chance that someone standing in that circle with you falls into that category, right? Abortion. The numbers are like 1 in 6 women have had an abortion. That's outside of the church and inside of the church. So if you start talking negatively about, I'm not saying you can't have your views on abortion, but if you start just talking about it like that, chances are you just alienated somebody because they had an abortion and now you kind of micro-aggressively judge them and kind of cast them out. We're not going to know all of those things, but we can start to practice by just understanding, like, there's the people that we kind of see and hang out with at church. We'll probably be able to see them and hang out with them outside of Sunday morning.
Mm-hmm.
So every Sunday, try to have one conversation with somebody that's not like you. And you can even be obvious about it. Say, hey, I was listening to the podcast. I'm trying to become faithful in this. And you're just, like, here's, you've got pink hair, or, you're really tall, and, or whatever it might be. And just, if we can start and practice with each other, then it'll become easier to do it outside of these walls.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think that's a really good challenge for us to actually take a step in practice towards building a relationship with someone that might not on the surface look like us, or we might judge doesn't think like us, or comes from a different background than we do, cultural diversity, whatever it happens to be, to actually take a step toward building a relationship with someone like that. I really do think, that is the answer. I remember when we were, a couple summers ago, when racial tensions were so high, that was one of the steps given there to say, okay, build a relationship, because a relationship is a bridge. It's a bridge that we can then walk across to each other. Certainly within the church, that's got to be incredibly important. And I think, Jesus wanted for his church to be that. Paul calls the church a body. There's no doubt about that. So we are supposed to be that community, as you talked about, the upside down kingdom. I love that terminology and the pictures that brings to mind. Mm-hmm. So I'll say first, thanks to Rob again for joining us this week, and thanks to all of you who've been listening for joining us as well. Want to say, as we do at the end of every podcast, if you'd like to reach out to us with either a question or a comment, you can send us an email at practicemakesfaithful@gmail.com. We love your thoughts, your feedback, of course, your encouragement as well. Also like to invite you to leave a rating or a review, which is definitely helpful for us on our podcast platforms. And of course, as you walk through life and as you follow Jesus, I do want to remind you that it's practice makes faithful, not practice makes perfect. That is, practice makes faithful. So go live out in faithful practice what it is that you've heard today and what Jesus is calling you into. Until next week, God bless you.